Thanks everybody, it's very good to be here, simply because this is a presentation which tries to contextualize in some respects my academic history in terms of my critical approach to business and approaches to business management with my contemporary interest in why games and play are actually something that businesses should be interested in. Yet at the same time they should be doing so in a much more ethical way than many consultants and organisations would perhaps lead you to believe. So this is very much an overview presentation. It assumes that you don't have any background in business management, critical management studies, but there are some sections that I will sort of whiz over because they're fairly sort of standard concepts. So for example, I'll talk a little bit about theories of motivation, but I'm not going to go into them in any depth because it's not really what the presentation is about. So what I really wanted to do to start was talk about why businesses are interested in games. Now, if you speak to businesses about why they're interested in games, they'll probably talk about the first two of those possibilities. The idea that games can perhaps help them develop better motivation and engagement among their employees, or that it can help improve their organisational processes, either to be more efficient or to be more innovative and so on. Those two things, the focus first of all on people and then secondly on process, is something that obviously managers are very concerned about in their day-to-day interactions and goings on. However, when we look more critically at management theory and some of the ways in which games and gamification in business is being discussed in the literature, we have these two other possibilities. So the actual management of work, or the control and supervision of workers, is one aspect that's being extensively discussed. And then finally, a critical reimagining of what work is and what it means in our society. Now, that last one is one that most everyday managers probably would not give you as an answer when asking why are businesses interested in games. However, I would say that that doesn't mean that this is not deeply underlying a lot of the things that may well be going on culturally in our society at this time. So I think it's quite useful and valuable to think about that. I am going to talk a little bit about this question at the bottom of this next slide, which is business a game? Now, I've introduced that question partly as a flippant query, but partly reflecting that final category, the question of what it is that we're doing with games in work. Are we reimagining work in a different way for our contemporary society? So first of all, two concepts which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. The first, the concept of the magic circle from Johann Huizinga. The notion that when we establish a play or game space, we are establishing a social environment which is in some way different or special. And in Homo Ludens, Huizinga discusses the examples of law courts and religious ritual as things that perhaps emerge culturally after a play process has initiated them. So he talks about how playing or reenacting the stories of the gods become religious rituals and ceremonies. So we've got these special spaces where the rules that apply in ordinary life are suspended and different rules apply. And these play arrangements are not necessarily facile, they're not necessarily non-serious. Again, he highlights particular historical examples such as mortal combat over people's guilt, for example. So these can have deadly consequences. Just because they're a magic circle or a game doesn't mean that they're not serious. And then we have the oft extended and debated element of the distinction between play and game, which again I don't intend to go into in particular depth here. I think it was more than adequately covered at a previous talk, so I won't go and sort of treat you like you don't know what I'm talking about and the difference between the two things. But if we think about the similarities between the two concepts of play and game, I think we can identify that they're both freely chosen activities. And the distinction is that games, perhaps as far as Huizinga is concerned anyway, we already know the rules before we enter into the play space, or we've already had some notion of how we should practice this play activity. So that leads to my question, is business a game? Because frankly, the business sphere is one that quite often we hold as separate to ordinary and everyday life. The rules are special and different. We learn how to behave in a business environment in a number of socializing activities that we experience in the transition from youth to adulthood. And part of discovering how to represent ourselves in paper, such as curriculum vitae and so on, is all part and parcel of what we might describe as a gamified process. So in that sense, we could talk about how entering the world of business is entering a game. Then we could also talk about how business itself is a game of changing the social and material world. If you think about how we talk about economics and the market in political discourse, again, it is almost treated as if it is a separate world to our social and political world. The legal structures around business and corporations, for example, the institution of limited liability, in and of itself creates corporate persons who inhabit this game space of business. It's not the CEO of a given firm that is the entity that is damaged should a firm go under. Their reputation may well be affected, but they are held to be separate entities. And that legal distinction, again, sets business apart as perhaps having its own social circle. So that's me just kind of setting up this question about how we can think about business as a game and start thinking about it analytically in that context. But a slight disclaimer. Hamilton in 2009 wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Business Ethics and warns against the metaphoric fallacy of discussing business as a game or a sport, particularly as a dangerous route in the sense that by using sporting metaphors when talking about business, we're often overlooking the serious social and ethical implications of making particular business choices. And I wanted to emphasize that in asking this question, is business a game, I do not intend to promote that metaphoric use of the game. I'm using it in the sense of Huizinga's idea of play preceding culture as an analytical tool to try and understand and shine a different theoretical lens onto what businesses do and how they operate. So I entirely agree with Hamilton that this is something to be worried about. But to start with this first dimension then, motivation and engagement, the people that inhabit organizations and play these games. Well, first of all, the concept of games occurring as part of work is neither new nor to be affiliated entirely with the digital or half-digital lives that many of us now inhabit. We can talk about the invisible hand of the market, as I've suggested, the very concept of an economic space being separate as being a playing space or a game space. If we look back at some of the original theoretical work on bureaucracy and setting rules down as to how we ought to organise from Max Weber in the very sort of like last century, there's this idea that jurisdiction is limited. Okay, so we have fixed roles in organisations and we can only act within the jurisdiction of our role. So it's beginning to sound very much like a game manual, right? Some of the the extensive rules and regulations around work that were very common at that time and still persist in many organisations today. Then there are a multitude of studies from the 1970s and onwards, and even earlier if we wanted to take this lens and apply it to the Taylorist studies around scientific management and things like the time and motion studies around the early analysis of factory work, where there's this concept that workers are only interested in getting their paycheck at the end of the day. They are in fact in opposition to the owners or the managers of the firm, and they don't necessarily know the best way to perform their job effectively, or even if they know it, they're not motivated to achieve it. Instead, they are motivated to engage in soldiering, which is basically to laze about as long as the boss doesn't catch you. So there's this concept of a war between employees and management, and that has been looked at in the context of war as a game in the workplace. And then again, to go back to this notion of games as metaphor, there's extensive histories of the use of simulation and strategic planning that draws on warlike games and strategy simulation, where we can look at historical examples of getting managers to read The Art of War, and also contemporary work around Porter's strategic theories around the 5 forces and things like game theory. This is all being perpetuated on MBA programs across the world. So there's this notion that managers are being trained to think of themselves as gamers in the business environment. Another way to look at it is to look at the way in which games have emerged as worker activities. So in 1969, Donald Roy wrote a fabulous piece of in-depth ethnographic research entitled Banana Time, which talks about the monotony of working in a factory and how he struggled to get through the working day without creating games for himself initially. So he talks about operating a die cutting machine and promising himself, once I've done 100 sheets of blue, I'll move on to the red ones. He then talks about how working in an informal group setting in the same factory resulted in the emergence of all kinds of social games between him and the other employees. And he describes how the working day was structured around things like Coke time, which is when someone would agree to go to the vending machine and get everybody a Coke. And also banana time, which is when ritually, every day without fail, people in the workplace would steal somebody's banana from their packed lunch. So hence Banana Time, the name of the paper. And then finally, if we look at a lot of contemporary management theory which talks about lean and agile methodologies, this too has a basis in games and trying to eliminate waste and be more efficient. And if you don't think that total quality management and Scrum methodologies has nothing to do with games, I do encourage you to play Overcooked or any other game that requires resource management, and you'll see that there is a very direct correlation between the processes that are being taught to project managers alongside the processes that are being used as something that we play supposedly for fun and enjoyment.
It's not fun. It's not fun.
So, when we're thinking about this and the gamification of work, I think it's important to consider that we have a history around theories of motivation and goal setting in studies of organisation and management, where a lot of contemporary approaches embrace these concepts of motivation, which suggest that managers' and workers' interests are fundamentally in alignment. Whereas if we go back to, I have added these titles because they're impactful rather than because they're analytical. If we go back to McGregor's Theory X, which was the concept fundamentally that workers were more or less rational but also more or less lazy and wouldn't really do things unless they were told you'll get a pay bonus if you achieve this limit, etc., etc. You have this concept of workers who are engaged in servitude, right? So they're motivated in as much as there are very clear, very self-evident positive or negative reinforcements to their behaviours. We then have, so again that's sort of the 1950s and earlier, we're talking about that. Then between the 60s, 70s, all the way through to the 90s, and very much I think flow is still in the contemporary debates now, we see a shift away from this idea of oppositional relations between workers and management, through first the idea that workers are motivated by responsibility for their work, which is where we find some of the initial work around things like quality circles, to workers being engaged in social participation in the workplace and fulfilling those needs and desires, through to attempting to achieve a balance between challenge, capabilities and reward, which is where we see the contemporary work on flow. Now, of course, the contemporary work on flow is associated with positive psychology, but has been very embedded in the design literature around games, and this is where we find a lot of correlation between contemporary consultant materials on why businesses should have games, okay? Particularly why businesses should employ consultants to design games for them. And this is where we start to see this focus on organizational processes. So games, instead of emerging or correlating between business activity and what's going on in the inhabitants of the organization, instead we see this intentional intervention in organizational processes through the introduction of games and competition. So on the one hand, we see things like very simple goal setting, and again, this has been going on for decades and decades. Things like leaderboards, employee of the month, performance-related pay, rewards and incentives, again, go back to very early factory work. You see it in the 1920s, 1930s. And then what you can see on the right here is actually a leaderboard that is being recommended, a digitized version for contemporary car sales representatives. So not a lot changing in that respect. But increasingly we also see it used with things like digital badging for non-function oriented goals. So organizations are embracing the idea that they should not only be using these techniques to meet their targets, achieve more output, make more sales, but also to enhance their employee well-being, encourage them to engage in charitable activities, build it into their CSR planning and so on. It's strange, I know, but CSR, corporate social responsibility activity. So for example, there are quite a lot of organisations who try to incentivise their employees to do volunteering for their designated charity. When I say incentivise, it's sometimes more required than voluntary work. And then we see the rise of gamification and gamification consultancy. I didn't want to get into intensive and in-depth debates around definitions of gamification, but I have taken this one from Koivisto in 2017, which is a sort of amalgam of Detterding and a number of the other very well-known definitions of gamification. And it's very ambiguous, but this idea of supporting user value creation using intentional game-like affordances or design principles in order to produce psychological and behavioural outcomes, generally outside of a uniquely game context. So this idea that gamification is taking the principles of game design out of a game context, plugging them into a work context, intentionally in order to try and improve motivation, psychological outcomes, behavioural outcomes, actual behaviours in the workplace, and so on. But we see this happening not only in a production context, in businesses, but also in a consumption context. So it's widely being employed in marketing, as well as being employed to actually interact with employees. So we can look at things like the use of scenarios and play as part of strategy, education and planning. This is the big Lego serious play thing at the moment, right? Okay. And I won't say that Lego serious play is not useful for strategy, education and planning, but at the same time there's a very interesting correlation between pay us more money to be trained to use these more expensive products for strategy education, because who are the people who are going to pay money for strategy education? The top level executives who have access to the most funds. Then we have the long history of using games as part of team building and enhancing team relationships. So focusing on the psychological outcomes between employees in order to hopefully enhance behavioural achievements. But we can still go back to things like the target till game, which has been used as an initial marker point or point of analysis, which was again very much this idea of a sort of a performance related game that was embedded in the till process at target stores to try and motivate workers to be faster, things like that. And then we see what I think is quite interesting, a bit of a distinction between simulation training, which is the use of scenarios, and compliance training, which seems to use narratives. So I'm not sure if that's a meaningful distinction or a distinction that I've just drawn in terms of the different products that appear to be out there on the market. But compliance training, from what I gather, seems to be this idea that we can gamify something that people don't want to do, and that will motivate them to do it. Whereas simulation training is more a case of we have to embed these skills for possible future scenarios. So it's a bit less motivational and a bit more about what could possibly go wrong in terms of a training outcome. And then if we look at consumer engagement, of course there's a long history of the use of competitions and buyer incentives and so on, but increasingly in entertainment marketing, seeing a lot more gamification, the use of games in order to spread the word about new products. So I don't suspect that there's anything in that list that you have not heard of in one way or another, but I thought it might be useful to cover the ways in which these activities are being introduced at various different levels of the organisational process. What I think is interesting is the way in which they're occurring not only at consumption and production level, but at production level they're also occurring at a variety of different levels of the organisation. So there's gamification of onboarding procedures, so when you recruit people, and then there's gamification for executive training. So it's encompassing the whole swath of the organisational chart. But this is where it gets interesting in terms of thinking about the management of work and what function this gamification might also be enacting beyond the concept of giving people skills or information so that the company is compliant. So first of all, we have the opportunity of using games as part of supervision and discipline. So panopticism, or the panopticon, can you just wave if that's something you've not heard of? Right, okay.
I'm talking about the prisons where the
prison guards
that's
the one.
Around and down every
So the panopticon is extensively discussed in terms of organisational power relations, because it's a great example of how you can use organisational infrastructure to convince employees to internalise discipline. So you don't have to rely on the manager standing over, supervising, watching someone to make them do something the right way. They don't know if they're being watched, therefore they internalise and they try to ensure that they're always behaving in a compliant manner. So the issue is that contemporary games, what various different writers, including O'Donnell, have referred to as the game-pocalypse, the extensive introduction of games into non-game activities and pervading everyday life, operate in a two-way fashion increasingly as digital products. So they don't only communicate the game algorithm and the activity to the person engaging in it, but they also feed back analytics to the app owner, the manager, whoever it might be. And that feedback process is an information generating mechanism. It's a surveillance mechanism. So the employee of the month leaderboard is no longer just something that your manager is sticking on the wall. It's something that you have an organization of 10,000 people and you can identify the lowest percentile performers and why. All right, so if you're using some of these activities, you can actually analyticize all the sorts of things that your employees are doing. There's also the fact that by introducing gamification, this is the introduction of a simplifying schema to organizational practices, okay? Particularly in large companies, what is actually going on in the day-to-day operations of any given department is complex, political. There may be multiple objectives at any given point. And by simplifying that down to a game using goals and targets, it's a gross simplification of what the objective of the overall organization might be about. So games introduce the concept that problems are predefined and have clear solutions. Information is unambiguous. There are clear win criteria a lot of the time, and it also introduces the notion that the playing field is a fair one. And quite frankly, if any of those things represent a contemporary workplace, I've yet to see one. So this idea that gamification is a representation of what's going on in the organization is very problematic. But at the same time, we also have this notion of playing to resist, which we can track all the way back to games and soldiering introduced by employees as a means of messing about with managers, the sort of the war games of the early factory period. The disruptive potential of play for employees is that by introducing games, by ludifying the work environment, you are allowing employees to also introduce game modifications, game rules, different styles of play as mechanisms for engaging with your objectives. So there's a lot of potential there. And there's some very interesting contemporary research on how employees in using apps, so employees working for firms such as Uber or Lyft or Deliveroo, are trying to find interesting ways of playing the algorithm in order to resist the requirements of the sort of management, even though the manager in this sense is an app. So things like apparently many airports have designated pickup points now. You have to pay a fee to use these pickup points. There are particular areas, geographical areas, where if your GPS says you are not within the right distance, you won't get allocated jobs from the airport, which are generally very lucrative. So Uber drivers, for example, are finding strange, like odd corners, fields and things that are technically just inside the boundary so that they can get pickup jobs from the airport, but they don't have to pay the fees. Things like that. And they have the opportunity to change the rules of the game by exposing the fact that the game is part of a magic circle. By puncturing that circle and saying, but this way that you're managing us is just a game, isn't it? So actually, we can completely delete that as a non-serious way of achieving our objectives. And instead, if this is what you really want us to do, we can suggest alternative ways of doing that. So there are different ways in which the game framing can also be used as a mechanism for resistance rather than playing with the game or introducing your own games. But there are limits to resistance. Again, we can go back to some of the early cultural studies, such as Collinson, 1988, Engineering Humour, who basically points out that a lot of gameplay can help release tension, but actually undermines the balance of power between employees and managers. So the culture of play can undermine resistance. And if we look at some of the more contemporary research that's been done in Germany by Antal and Strauss, the existing relations and commitment to particular organizational identities, so I am a manager or I am a product owner, people are very committed in terms of their careers are tied up in those labels. So once you want to use play, or once you want to engage playfully with organizational structures, you have to be willing to put those labels or those identities at risk. And sometimes that's a big risk for individuals in terms of the real consequences of doing that. And then there are other factors of that as well with respect to the receptiveness, to the degree to which organizations have actually introduced and are committed to these processes of gamification, or to what point is it just a gloss on harder underlying relations. And then of course there's the broader employment context. If you can walk out of your organization into another job, you might feel more able to playfully resist the new management technique than if the employment context is a little bit more challenging. So this approach really kind of looks at games as not a management tool, but as part and parcel of a management ideology, where we can either see games as hard power, direct, serious interventions that are specifically aligned to the organizational process, things such as performance-related pay that is embedded in a gamified algorithm, which we can take Uber as an example of that, an extreme example of that, and things like the gamepocalypse, the extension of making the game be in charge instead of a person that you can maybe negotiate with, and so on. Or we can also look at this in terms of the use of games as soft power. So there's been quite a lot of discussion around Playber. I don't know if anybody's come across that. No? So this relates primarily to Marxist arguments and an increasing debate around immaterial labour, digital labour, some of which is financially recompensed and some of which is not. So in the context of people who are playing games, for example, who are playing games in order to produce digital products that they can then sell for real money on a legitimate or illegitimate marketplace, gold farming, etc. There's the question that that is often illegitimate, but it's exploited labour, right? And then furthermore, we can look at the way in which organisations, including game companies, actually require, in order for their product to be successful, an extensive amount of unpaid immaterial labour to contribute towards building their world, testing their mechanics, and so on. And Taylor et al. Have also argued that this process actually promotes a particular neoliberal entrepreneurial subjectivity. In order to play this game, and maybe win, being a movable feast, you actually need to adopt this very conventional, hard-working, willing to spend many, many hours logged into the game, committed neoliberal subjectivity. And you see it, their analysis was focused on EVE Online, but you see it in a lot of large MMORPGs. Back in 2005, Costea, Crump and Holm suggested that this is actually part of a larger cultural shift. So in terms of the ideology of work, we're moving from an ideology based on self-discipline, the classical example being the Protestant work ethic, the idea that you work very hard in order for a moral benefit, not a financial benefit, towards a model of self-affirmation. So work is where we go to become better selves, but not in a moral sense, more in a sort of like self-actualization sense. Morgan and Nelligan's book, which I confess I have not read fully, that's come out recently, criticises this as part of the creativity hoax. They've said it's basically set dressing by organisations where they are projecting the idea of a ludic and gamified work experience in order to recruit people into jobs that are actually fundamentally quite meaningless and not actually all that self-affirming. So there's those kind of multiple approaches to looking at how we can see gamification and the ludification of work environments as part and parcel of these broader ideological trends in how management gets the workers to work. But that's the dark side. So let's try and end things on a slightly happier note, shall we? Reimagining work, the potential of play and play spaces. So initially, the potential of play to enhance work relies primarily on the idea that we can reject the mundane or we can glorify the ordinary. So there are a lot of uninspiring mundane tasks that we have to complete in our day-to-day life. For example, domestic labour, cleaning the dishes, doing your laundry, all of these activities need to be done. We might hope that we're going to have a future of fabulous robot servants and this is not going to be necessary, but they were promising that 50 years ago and we're still not there. So instead, what we've got is we've got gamified apps which allow us to engage in that kind of activity in a way where it's still rubbish and not very enjoyable, but increasingly it's all right because I've got an app where I get XP for every time I do the dishes and it makes me feel better about it. Right? And if you haven't used Epic When, you should. So this glorification of the ordinary is happening in the workplace as well. The principle of play, where play is intrinsically motivating and freely chosen, perhaps unlike work, suggests that we can transform our work experience by making work more like play. Opening up the frame of work in that context, it also provides opportunities for a renegotiation of purpose and work identities. So play offers us a greater potential for work with meaning, whether it's mundane work where the meaning is being supplied through the gamification process, or whether it's actually an opportunity to reevaluate the actual functions of the work that we do and what businesses are doing in the first place in order to have more meaningful impacts in the world. That's also something that play has the potential to do in terms of opening up those objectives. Play as an innovation mechanism in that context offers the promise of better work design. So sometimes the work itself is not intrinsically alienating, depressing, uninteresting, but bad management might be. Okay? If we can use play as an innovation mechanism to find better ways of managing work processes and also to embrace more holistic work objectives, then we can support the expansion of social, ecological and political value as well as economic value. And this is where a variety of play-based interventions, I think, have a lot of potential. Yet, the dangers of play and gamification as a mechanism purely for value extraction, infantilization, and the exploitation of workers remain serious ethical and practical challenges. So, I'd like to finish by saying that businesses in their embrace of play and gamification really do need to address the question, what is it that we are playing for? Thank you very much.